The letter arrived before sunrise, and it did not bother with pleasantries. Sarah Valen had been awake since before the birds started, which was nothing new for her. Sleep, in her experience, was not something that lasted until morning without argument. Her mind had a habit of deciding it was done, and leaving the rest of her to sort out what came next. So she had been sitting at the kitchen table of the small stone cottage she shared with her aunt, holding a cup of cold water and watching the thin gray light creep under the door, when the knock came, sharp and quick, the kind of knock from someone who had a job to do and intended to finish it regardless of the hour. She opened the door and found a courier in black livery, already turning his horse. He had set the envelope on the doorstep without waiting for her to reach for it. He rode back into the morning fog at a pace that suggested he found the whole errand deeply unpleasant and wanted to be done with it. Sarah stood in her bare feet on the cold stone and looked at the envelope in the gray half-dark before she had quite decided to pick it up. The seal pressed into the black wax looked back at her like a warning she had already been given. 7 stars, arranged around an iron gate, the mark of the Elder Council. She had seen that seal exactly once before in her life, when it had appeared on the evacuation notices for the southern mills 3 years ago after the Great Flood. Back then, the letters had gone to trade lords and village leaders, to people with names that carried weight in the kingdom's administrative structures. They had not, as a rule, gone to healers' apprentices in borrowed cottages in small villages who had no title, no rank, and no particular reason to appear on anyone's important list. She went back inside. She sat at the table. She unfolded the letter in the lamplight and read it from the first word to the last, which took under a minute, because it was not long. The council did not waste words. It required her presence at the royal palace within 48 hours. The matter was described as being of significance to the kingdom. Her cooperation was described as not optional. And at the very bottom of the page, separated from the rest of the text by a thin drawn line, as though it had been added as an afterthought, that was not an afterthought at all, the letter noted that the protection charter for the village of Hollow Creek was currently under review by the council's land committee, and the outcome of that review would depend on the resolution of her assigned task. Sarah read that final section twice. Then she set the letter face down on the table and looked at the ceiling. 300 families lived in Hollow Creek. Her aunt was one of them. The baker on the market road who always kept end pieces for her was one of them. The woman who had held Sarah's hand at her mother's burial and said nothing, because she understood that nothing was sometimes the most honest thing available, was one of them. Old Hartley, who sat outside the mill in the afternoons and told stories that were probably 50% invention, but were always worth hearing, was one of them. The school teacher who had spent a full winter making sure Sarah could read well enough to begin her studies. The farmer who grew the lavender she used in half her remedies. The midwife who had delivered half the children currently running through the village. All of them were in Hollow Creek, and Hollow Creek without its charter was a group of people standing on land they could no longer legally call their own, without protection, without trade rights, without standing in any court in the kingdom. She stood up. She went to her room. She pulled her traveling bag from under the bed, and she packed it with the careful, systematic attention of someone who had learned early that packing badly made every difficult thing that followed slightly worse. Her good clothes. Her healer's kit. The compact leather roll of tools that Greta had given her at the start of her second year of study, which she had not once left anywhere overnight in 4 years. Her reference books, the 2 most important ones, the ones with her own margin notes in the corners of most pages. Her journal, which was half full and which she planned to continue filling, because writing things down helped her think through them and she expected to need all the thinking help available to her. She left a note on the kitchen table for her aunt. It said that she had been called away for work and would return as soon as she was able to. She did not explain further, because explaining further would require her to explain the part about the charter, and she did not want her aunt to spend the next 90 days worried about the village's standing, when there was nothing her aunt could do about it except worry. She was on the road east before the village fully woke up. The journey took a day and a half, which gave her considerable time to think. She walked the first section of the road, then caught a ride in the back of a grain merchant's cart as far as the crossroads, then walked the remaining miles to the palace road. The morning of the second day was overcast and cold, and she walked faster than strictly necessary, partly because of the cold and partly because moving quickly was easier than moving slowly when her mind was moving at the speed it was currently moving at. She was not sure what she was going into. She knew what the letter said, and she knew what the letter meant about the stakes involved, but she did not know the shape of the actual task, and that uncertainty was the thing she found most difficult. Greta had trained her to be thorough about what she did not know, to sit with the gaps in her understanding, rather than filling them with guesses, because guesses that felt like knowledge were more dangerous than acknowledged ignorance. But sitting with gaps was easier when you were not also walking toward something that had consequences the size of 300 families' security. She thought about what she did know. She knew the king's name and reputation, which were both well established in the kingdom. King Aldrich Voss had been on the throne for 6 years following the death of his father, and had maintained the kind of reign that people described in careful, neutral language. Effective, they said, and competent, and firm. No one said warm. No one said beloved. No one said the kind of things people said about rulers who made their subjects feel seen. The stories that circulated about him were not cruel. He was not described as unjust or violent or arbitrary, but they had a quality of distance to them, as if he were being described from farther away than a king should be from the people he governed. She wondered what a healer's apprentice was supposed to do about any of that, and she had not yet arrived at an answer when the palace appeared on the horizon of the second afternoon. It came into view between two low hills, and the first thing she thought was that it looked like something that had decided to stay a very long time. The stone was dark and weathered, the kind of weathered that came from generations rather than years. The towers were sharp against the pale gray sky. The outer walls were tall and in good repair, which meant maintenance without softening. Kept strong because strength was required, not made beautiful because beauty was not the point. The iron gates at the main entrance were wide enough to accommodate a carriage, and tall enough to suggest that whoever had designed them had wanted visitors to feel the scale of the place before they ever got inside. Sarah walked up to the gate without stopping, which she had decided was the only way to approach it. Hesitation at a gate that size did nothing useful. She presented the council's letter to the guard on duty. He looked at it, checked her name against a list in a logbook, gave her a look that was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, but simply the professional look of someone executing a specific task, and stood aside to let her through. She was met immediately inside by Elda. The head steward of the palace was a woman of perhaps 50, with silver hair pinned back into a precise arrangement that had clearly never given her a moment's trouble, and the manner of someone who had organized complex operations for long enough that she had shed all unnecessary motion. She moved quickly through the stone corridors, and she spoke with the same economy, providing essential information without decoration or delay. She told Sarah the mealtimes, the layout of the wings she would have access to, the names of the staff she might need to deal with, and the basic schedule of palace life. Then she said that the council was waiting, and brought her to the chamber. The round room with its 7 chairs felt cold before Sarah stepped into it, and colder when she was standing in the center of it. 7 people in dark robes looked at her with the careful attention of people who made large decisions and had developed a highly refined sense of what they were working with when they looked at a new face. She stood still and returned their attention and waited for them to speak first, because waiting in situations like this was almost always more useful than filling the silence. Councillor Fenn spoke first, as he had apparently done in this chamber for a very long time. He was the eldest by some years, white-haired, with eyebrows so thick they seemed to have an independent quality, and a voice that had the settled authority of a man who had learned to be patient with the pace at which important things moved. He told her about the king. The picture that emerged was one she found herself listening to with complete attention, because it was more precise than the rumors she had traveled with. Aldrich Voss was not a failing king. His governance was technically sound. His military decisions had been correct. His legal judgments were fair and consistently applied. There had been no scandals, no crises of his making, no failures of the obvious kind. But there was a slow erosion happening in the kingdom that was harder to quantify than any of those things. An erosion of the human relationship between a king and his kingdom. The thing that made people feel that their leader was a person who existed in the same world they did, rather than a function that processed governance from behind a closed door. The border lords were loyal to the crown as an institution, Fenn said, but had no personal anchor to the man wearing it. The diplomatic relationships with neighboring kingdoms had become strained, not because of any particular wrong move, but because the people on the other side of the table never felt they had actually met anyone, only a position, precisely maintained. The palace staff moved through their days carefully, which was not the same as happily, and the people of the kingdom, who had never seen their king speak about anything beyond the formal requirements of his office, had begun to speak of him in the way people spoke of weather, as something that affected them, that had to be accommodated, but that was not in any way theirs. The council wanted to change this. They had tried, cautiously and indirectly, through various other approaches over the previous 2 years. None had moved anything. They had concluded that a different kind of effort was required. Not a political approach, not an advisor, not a courtier with an agenda. Something more fundamental. Someone whose specific training was in the quiet work of reaching people who had sealed themselves off, and whose presence would not trigger the king's well-developed resistance to anything that carried the smell of strategy. They had selected Sarah. They gave her 90 days. They told her the king had been informed only that she was a healer assigned to the palace for a general consultation. They did not tell him the nature of her actual purpose, because they believed that knowing it would cause him to close himself off before she had a chance to begin. Sarah absorbed all of this. She had one question. "If I fail," she said, "Hollow Creek loses its charter." Fen looked at her steadily. "The review will be decided accordingly." She nodded, once, slowly, the way you nod when something you already knew is confirmed. Then she said, "I will try." She was brought to her room in the East Wing by a page boy named Ned, who had brown hair that did whatever it liked, and the slightly anxious helpfulness of someone who was always trying to be more useful than he was certain he managed to be. He talked while he walked her through the corridors, small things, practical things, the kind of information that did not make it into official orientations, which kitchen staff made the best tea, what time the herb garden got the best morning light, which corridor floors were uneven enough to trip over if you came through them in the dark. She liked him immediately. He was the kind of person who smoothed the surfaces of difficult environments by attending carefully to their smaller details, and who probably did not know that this was a skill, or that not everyone had it. He started to say something as they turned the corner of the East Wing. She had already turned the corner, and what was there required no introduction. The cat was sitting in the exact center of the corridor, with the absolute, settled authority of something that had reviewed all available locations, and selected this one for reasons that were entirely its own, and that it was not going to explain. It was large, notably, substantially large, in the way of animals that had always been well fed, and that occupied space as a matter of established fact, rather than as any kind of statement. The fur was silver gray, catching the low hall light, and doing something almost luminous with it. And the eyes were gold, not yellow, not amber, but genuinely gold, the color of something expensive held very close to a flame, and they fixed on Sarah, the moment she came around the corner, with an attention that was complete and entirely motionless. The cat did not tense. It did not gather itself as if deciding what to do. It simply looked at her, with the expression of something that had already formed a considered opinion, and was now simply deciding how long to hold it before acting on it. "That is Cypher," Ned said from behind her, very quietly, in the tone of someone relaying information they felt the other person should have had before this moment arrived. "He belongs to the king. He has for 3 years. He doesn't usually let people past. Most of the staff go around through the south corridor when he's..." Sarah kept her eyes on the cat. She had worked with animals enough to understand the basics of what was happening. This was not a threat display. It was an assessment. The cat was reading her. Whether she was the kind of thing that deserved to be in this corridor. What she would do if he held his ground. She stepped forward, not quickly, not aggressively, steadily, with the same calm she used when approaching a patient who had every reason to be frightened and none yet to trust her. She kept her body slightly angled rather than moving straight at him, and she did not look away from his eyes, but she did not look at them with the fixed, challenging stare that an animal read as aggression. She looked at him the way she looked at everything in a new environment, openly, without demanding anything in return. She walked past him at a distance of about 12 inches, and she did not deviate from her path. Cypher's head turned, tracking her passage with a smoothness so slow it was almost imperceptible. When she had passed him entirely, he turned to face forward again, and if a cat could be said to file something away for later consideration, his expression suggested that was precisely what he was doing. Behind her, she heard Ned release a breath that had been held for perhaps 30 seconds. Her room was at the end of the East Wing corridor. Clean, plain, exactly what it appeared to be. A narrow bed with adequate blankets, a wardrobe, a writing desk with a low-burning oil lamp already lit on its surface, a small mirror above the desk, and a window looking out over the palace's herb garden 2 floors below. She could see the garden's shape from here, the organized beds, the irregular spread of what looked like thyme, along one south wall, a stone bench near the fence. It looked like a place that had been maintained correctly for years, without anyone paying it much attention beyond what was required. She sat at the desk and opened her journal to the first blank page. She wrote the date. She wrote 3 sentences about the task, the charter, the king, the 90 days. Then she paused for a moment and added a 4th sentence. There is also a cat named Cypher who has not yet decided what I am to him, and I believe he is smarter than 3 of the 7 council members I met today, and possibly 4. She set the pen down and looked at the window for a while. She had 25 minutes before dinner. She used 12 of them sitting with her eyes closed, breathing slowly, which was something Greta had taught her to do before walking into situations that required her to be more settled than she currently felt. She used the remaining 13 to change her shirt, comb her hair, and wash her face at the basin, because it seemed important to arrive at her first meal in this palace as herself. Not road-worn and trailing 2 days of anxiety behind her, but simply herself, present and ready, and not performing anything in particular. She walked to the dining hall. It was a long room, stone-walled, with iron candle holders along the walls and a table that was clearly not expecting a large gathering. The setting was for a small number of people, placed correctly, without ceremony but without casualness either. The staff moved through the space with a particular quality of silence that she noticed immediately. Not the silence of contentment, but the silence of people who had learned that quietness was the safest approach. It was the kind of quiet she had encountered in homes, where someone unpredictable lived, and which told you something important about the environment, without anyone saying a word. King Aldrich Voss was already seated at the head of the table when she walked in. He was reading a document, one hand resting on the table beside it, his dinner set in front of him. He did not look up when she entered. She sat at the place set for her and waited. She looked at him because she had come all this way in order to look at him, and she saw no reason to pretend she wasn't doing so. She had built a picture of him in her mind during the journey, assembled from the reputation that preceded him into every corner of the kingdom. She had expected the reality to match the reputation more closely than it did. He was perhaps 30, dark brown hair that was neat without being arranged. A build that said he worked hard and probably had most of his life, not the decorative build of someone who trained to look impressive, but the functional strength of someone who did actual physical things. His posture was completely straight, and it was the straightness of a man who had stopped noticing it decades ago because it was simply how he existed. His face held a quality that she identified after a few seconds as the absence of performance, no expression arranged for anyone's benefit, no mask, but no openness either. Something that had settled into a neutral that was not pretending to be neutral but was simply what it was after years of practiced self-containment. His eyes, when he finally set the document down and looked at her, were amber, a warm color that existed in complete and apparently untroubling contradiction to the temperature of the room when he was in it. He looked at her for approximately 3 seconds. The look was thorough, impersonal, and without particular curiosity. The look of someone reviewing something they have already been given a summary of, and are confirming, is as described. "You are Greta's apprentice," he said. "Yes," she said. "4 years of study." "Yes." He nodded. Once, the nod of someone filing something correctly. He told her she could use the herb garden and the library. He told her the kitchen would provide whatever she requested. He told her Elda was the person to speak to about palace matters. He told her to stay out of the West Wing, without explaining why, in the tone of someone who had said this enough times that the explanation had been dropped long ago as an unnecessary addition. He told her she had until the first frost. Then he picked up his fork and went back to his dinner. Sarah looked at her own plate. Under the table, she pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. She thought about Greta, who had said once, on a particularly hard day, with a patient who was not cooperating with anyone's efforts to help them, that the most important thing in this work was not skill, and was not knowledge, and was not even the right remedy. It was the willingness to stay in a room that told you to leave, to stay quietly, without argument, without pushing, without filling every silence with reassurance that mostly reassured yourself, rather than the person you were trying to reach. to stay until the room got used to the fact that you were not going anywhere. From the corridor doorway, a large shadow sat at the edge of the light. Golden eyes that had not, she realized when she glanced that direction, moved from her face since she sat down. She picked up her fork. She intended to stay. Every one of the 90 days, she intended to stay. The second morning at the palace delivered something she had not anticipated, and it changed the shape of everything that followed it. She was in the herb garden before breakfast. She had gone down early because looking at growing things helped her think, and because the garden had caught her attention from the window of her room the previous evening in a way that was hard to explain, except to say that it was the only space in the palace that seemed to exist for its own sake rather than for someone's use of it. The beds were organized, but not perfectly maintained. There were weeds along the south wall that had been there long enough to put down roots, and the thyme had spread past its original boundary into the path between the eastern beds, which suggested that whoever maintained it worked to a standard of functional rather than perfect. She had been there for perhaps 15 minutes, crouching by the lavender to check the condition of the soil, when she became aware of a presence at the far end of the garden. She stayed very still. King Aldrich Voss stood near the iron fence at the garden's eastern boundary, and he was not doing anything that could be described with a verb. He was simply there. His back was to her. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at the fence line with an expression she could not see, but she could see his shoulders, and his shoulders said something that the table at breakfast had never said. They said tired, not in the way of someone who had not slept enough, but in the deeper way of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time, and had gotten used to the weight of it, but had not stopped feeling it. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes. Then something shifted, a bird, maybe, or the quality of the light as the morning advanced, and his shoulders came back to where they usually were, and his posture returned to the composed arrangement that was visible at breakfast. He turned and walked back toward the palace without looking in her direction. She let out a slow breath and turned back to the lavender. She thought about what she had just seen for the rest of the morning, and she carried it carefully because she understood that the things people showed when they did not know they were being seen were often the most accurate guide to what they actually needed. The days shaped themselves around a rhythm. Breakfast every morning at the same table, with the same silence that was not peaceful but had become predictable. The king arrived on time, ate efficiently, and said 2 or 3 sentences per meal, always informational, never personal, delivered in the measured voice he used for everything. She answered each thing he said with direct attention, and then gave the silence back to him without filling it, because filling it would have been about her own discomfort, and she had decided to stop prioritizing that. She explored the palace in the afternoons and evenings, not to learn its geography, but to learn its character, the way she had learned the character of the village she grew up in, not by studying a map, but by walking, and noticing, and listening. She learned which corridors the staff used when they wanted to move quickly, and which ones they used when they wanted to avoid being seen. She learned which rooms smelled of regular use, and which smelled of absence. She learned the palace's daily sounds, the kitchen noise that started before dawn, the particular pattern of footsteps that meant the afternoon advisors were arriving, the sound of the North Tower bell that the king's schedule was, she noticed, organized around with a precision that was almost impressive. On the 4th day she found the painting. It was in a narrow corridor on the 2nd floor of the north wing, not on any direct path between the rooms that received regular use. The corridor had 2 standard formal portraits with brass identification plates, and then a 3rd portrait with no plate at all. The 3rd portrait showed 2 young men standing together in a sunlit garden, both perhaps 16 or 17. One was unmistakably Aldrich. She could see the structure of his face, even at that age, the particular angle of his posture, the quality of containment that was apparently not acquired, but had been present from early on. The other was different in every way that was possible to be different while standing in the same space, lighter in build and expression, wider in his stance. His weight shifted forward, as if he had been caught in the middle of moving towards something he was looking forward to. His face was laughing. Not politely smiling, laughing. Genuinely. The full-body laugh of someone who found life entertaining and was not trying to moderate their response to it. Looking at the painting was like looking at 2 different theories about how to exist in the world, standing next to each other in a sunlit garden. She stood in front of it for a long time. The library became her primary afternoon location. partly because it was the most useful room in the palace for her purposes, and partly because it had windows that let in the afternoon light, and a particular quality of quiet that was not like the carefully maintained quiet of the rest of the palace. It was a natural quiet, the kind that came from rooms where people went to think, and it was easier to breathe in. She was there on the 6th afternoon when Ned found her, appearing in the doorway with the particular slightly out-of-breath quality that suggested he had been moving quickly and was now trying to look like he hadn't been. He made 2 minutes of conversation about the garden and the kitchen before getting to what he had actually come to say, which was, "He follows you." She looked up from her book. "Cypher," Ned said. "He's been following you since your second morning. Not close. 2 corridors back, sometimes more. He's never done that with anyone except the king." She thought about this carefully. "Has he made any move toward me?" "No. He just watches." She set her pen down. "Good," she said. Ned looked puzzled. She did not explain, because she was not sure she could have explained in a way that would have made sense without the years of training that had taught her the explanation. What she understood, and what Ned did not know he was telling her, was that there was an enormous difference between a cautious creature that kept its distance and a cautious creature that kept its distance while keeping you in its sightline. The second one was already something. The second one was attention, which was not the same as trust, but which was the ground in which trust could eventually grow if you did not make a single wrong move. She returned to her book. She did not turn around to look for Cypher when she left the library that evening, but at the top of the east wing staircase she felt, without needing to confirm it, the presence 2 corridors back, the particular quality of silent attention that she had begun to recognize the way you recognize something at the edge of your peripheral vision, not by looking at it directly, but by the way the air changed when it was there. On the 8th afternoon, she returned to the north corridor and stood in front of the painting again. She heard footsteps behind her while she was looking at it. She did not turn around, because she had learned in the past 8 days that Aldrich responded better to things that did not make a sudden move in his direction. She waited. The footsteps stopped. He said, "That corridor is not on the way to anything." "I know," she said. A pause. "There are faster routes to the library." "I am not going to the library today," she said. Silence. Long enough that she thought he would simply walk past and continue wherever he had been going. Then, in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, and that had the particular quality of something said before the editing process could stop it, his name was Cale. She kept her eyes on the painting, on the boy who stood with his weight forward, who laughed with his whole body, who looked like a person who had decided early that the world was interesting and had not been argued out of it. "He looks like someone who made rooms louder when he was in them," she said. A very long pause. "He did," Aldrich said. His footsteps resumed. He walked past her without slowing and turned the corner at the end of the corridor, and was gone. She stood in front of the portrait for another 2 minutes, and then she walked back to her room, and at the top of the east wing stairs, she found Cypher waiting, and he stood and walked ahead of her down the corridor and sat outside her door until she was inside. "Day 8, she wrote. "He told me the name of the boy in the painting. He did not mean to. Cypher walked me to my door for the first time. Neither of them has any idea that they have already started making decisions about me. I think they have." She looked at what she had written. She wrote one more line. "This is going to be more complicated than the council understood when they sent me here." The morning of the 14th day, Sarah tried something that failed completely, and she spent the next hour in the garden being honest with herself about why it had failed and what she was going to do differently. She had risen early and gathered a selection of what the herb garden offered in terms of fragrance and color, nothing elaborate, nothing that announced itself too loudly, and she had arranged it in a small clay pot she found in the kitchen stores and placed it at the center of the breakfast table before anyone else was up. It was the kind of thing that changed the quality of a space gently, the way living things did when they were simply present, and she had thought it was a reasonable beginning. Aldrich arrived at breakfast on schedule, sat in his chair, looked briefly at the arrangement, looked away, and read his morning documents. When the meal ended and the table was cleared, a kitchen staff member took the pot with the dishes because there had been no instruction to leave it, and no instruction had been given. Sarah went to the garden and sat on the stone bench near the south wall and thought carefully. The problem was not the flowers. The problem was what the flowers were, in the context of what she was trying to do. Greta called it the mirror problem. You focus so hard on the thing you are doing, the gesture, the approach, the offering, that you stop seeing whether it is landing, and you mistake your own sense of trying for actual connection. The flowers were about Sarah, trying. They were not about Aldrich. He had not asked for them, had not indicated a need for them, had no particular relationship to them. They were her idea of what might soften a person, not an actual response to who he was. And the difference between those two things was the difference between helping someone and performing helpfulness in front of them. She needed to stop performing. She needed to be present in the same space, actually present, without the performance of approach. She changed her method entirely. She stopped trying things. She moved through the palace the way she moved through any new environment she needed to understand, by being genuinely in it, not strategically. She talked with Ned when he appeared, because she genuinely liked Ned, and the conversations were worth having on their own terms. She worked in the library every afternoon, and the work was real work that produced a real output, an index of northern medicinal plants for Maris, who had asked for it, and whose practical purposes Sarah found more satisfying than most of what she had been doing with her afternoons. She spent time in the garden doing actual garden maintenance rather than gathering material for gestures, and the garden was better for it by the end of the first week of the new approach. She began to learn the palace's rhythms, in the way you learned a person's rhythms, when you lived with them long enough, not by studying them, but by absorbing them until they became part of the background of your own days. Aldrich's schedule was as precise as any schedule she had ever observed. Study from the morning correspondence until midday, exactly 20 minutes of walking in the north courtyard after lunch, afternoon petitioners and advisors, dinner at the same time every evening, and the light in his study window going out at approximately the same hour each night. He did not vary it. There was no leisure she could identify, no time that was unaccounted for, no space in the day that was not occupied by something that could be categorized as function. She thought about what it said about a person that they had organized their days to leave no room in them that was not assigned. On the 16th morning she was working at the north end of the herb garden, when she heard Aldrich's voice through the garden wall from the stable courtyard on the other side. He was speaking to one of the stable hands about a horse with an uneven gait. The conversation was brief and practical, and his tone was exactly as it was at breakfast, even, measured, without surplus. The stable hand gave him the information he needed. Aldrich thanked him in 2 words. The stable hand left. There was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds. And in that pause, she heard something that stopped her hands in the herb bed. It was barely there, a low sound, very quiet, that could have been almost anything if she had not spent 4 years developing the specific skill of hearing what people tried not to make audible. It was the sound of a man breathing carefully through a moment that was harder than it looked. The kind of sound that happened when someone's control was fully engaged, which meant there was something that required controlling. She stayed completely still. She did not make a sound. His footsteps resumed after a moment. He walked away across the stable courtyard. She heard the door. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sky above the garden wall for a while. She thought about the garden window on the second morning, his shoulders saying things his words never did. She thought about the painting in the north corridor. She thought about what it meant to organize your days so tightly that there was no unoccupied space, no place where whatever you were carrying might be able to move. She thought about what kind of weight required that much management. That evening, after dinner, she was crossing the corridor near her room when she found herself almost face to face with Maris, the palace cook, who had apparently been heading in the same direction and who stopped when she saw Sarah with the comfortable directness of a woman who had been working in this palace for 20 years, and had long ago stopped being deferential to anyone who was not the king. "How are you getting on?" Maris said. "Well enough," Sarah said. "I think." Maris looked at her with the knowing attention of someone who had watched many things happen in this palace from the vantage point of its kitchen, which was where, in Sarah's experience, most useful information about a household eventually made its way. "The king said more to you at breakfast yesterday than he said to the last 3 health consultants they sent combined," she said. Sarah considered this. "What did the last 3 do?" Maris shrugged broadly. "One tried to assess his diet and got told to go home by the end of the first week. One tried to implement a physical exercise program that the king was already doing on his own and took it as an insult. One came from the council to check on his mental state, and the king had him removed from the breakfast table on the second morning for asking questions that were, and I am quoting directly, inappropriate for the relationship we currently have. Sarah was quiet for a moment. He remembered me the second morning, she said slowly. He remembers everything, Maris said. That is one of the things about him that people usually find more alarming than reassuring. She folded her arms. But he remembered you specifically. Ned saw him ask Elda your name on the morning of your third day. He already knew your name. He was checking that he had it right. She paused, then added, with the tone of someone delivering a piece of information they consider significant, without editorializing about why. He has never done that before. Sarah walked back to her room that night and sat at the desk for a long time without opening her journal. Then she opened it and wrote one sentence. I have been approaching this as a task. I need to approach it as a person. She closed it. She was awake for a long time. The 23rd day produced three things. The worst sabotage yet, the closest thing to a smile she had seen on Aldrich's face, and the moment that changed the nature of the entire enterprise, in ways she had not anticipated when she got out of bed that morning. The morning began with the bread incident, which the kitchen staff would discuss with poorly concealed delight for most of the following week. Sarah had baked a small loaf herself, with Maris's blessing and the kitchen's good honey, rising early before the breakfast service to have time for it. She had not signed it. She had left it wrapped in clean cloth outside the study door at mid-morning, when she knew the afternoon petitioners were coming, and Aldrich had likely been working for several hours with nothing. She came back 40 minutes later to check whether it had been taken inside. Cypher was sitting on it. Not near it. On it. Precisely. Completely. With an expression of pure equanimity. As if sitting on cloth-wrapped objects in front of doorways was simply a thing he did, and he saw no need to account for it. The bread was flat. The honey had come through the cloth. Sarah looked at Cypher. Cypher looked at Sarah with the golden-eyed composure of a creature that has done exactly what it intended to do and has no concerns about the reception of this fact. From inside the study, she heard the soft sound of a single page turning. Just one. The pace of someone who had heard something outside their door and was choosing, deliberately, not to look. She picked up the cloth. She picked up the bread. She carried them back to the kitchen with the specific dignity of someone who has decided that reacting is not useful. Behind her, faintly, from the direction of the study, she heard a sound, so quiet and so brief that she nearly missed it, and would have dismissed it entirely if she had not been paying the kind of attention she had been paying since the second morning. It was the sound of a room where everything had been very still for a very long time, releasing one precise, small amount of tension. Not a laugh, not anything that could be called a laugh, but the precursor to one. The private, involuntary acknowledgement of something that, in a person who had not sealed themselves so thoroughly, would have come out as a laugh. She turned the corner and allowed herself a small, private smile. She spent the afternoon in the garden, working on the border beds, where the summer growth had overtaken the stone paths, and she was at the south end of the garden when she began talking out loud to herself about the situation with Cypher, which she occasionally did when thinking through something complicated, and which she only did when she believed she was alone. She said, to no one in particular, that the situation with the cat was becoming unnecessary, and that Cypher had clearly been making assessments about her since the first evening, and had apparently decided something, but that whatever he had decided, he was taking an unreasonably long time to act on, and that she understood why, because she was not in a particular hurry, and did not plan to push the matter, and that eventually, not immediately, not on any schedule she was imposing, she expected they would arrive at an understanding of some kind, and in the meantime, she was going to stop leaving food items where he could reach them. She stopped talking at the end of the south wall. She looked up. 2 floors above the garden, in the window directly above the south path, a figure stood in the low evening light, still, looking down. His face was not entirely clear at that distance, but the angle of his head was the angle of someone who was listening, and who had been listening for more than a moment. And at the corner of his mouth, barely, at the distance of 2 floors and a full garden's length, in the failing light of early evening, something moved, the smallest possible degree, in the direction of something that, in someone who had practiced smiling recently, would have qualified without question. He stepped back from the window. The light in the room behind him stayed on. Sarah stood in the garden for a long moment looking at the lit window. Then she went inside, climbed the stairs, turned the corner into the east corridor, and stopped. Cypher was sitting outside her room. He had been sitting outside her room on several recent evenings, and she had been leaving him to it without comment. But tonight he was sitting differently, not in his assessment position, but in a posture that was less watchful and more simply present, the way a thing sits when it has already made its decision and is waiting for the formality of the other party catching up. She sat down on the floor of the corridor, her back against the wall beside her door. She did not reach toward him. She did not speak. She simply sat in the corridor the way she had learned to sit in difficult rooms, without asking anything of them, without filling them with her own needs, just present. The corridor was quiet. The palace settled around her into evening. She listened to the wind at the upper window and the distant sound of the kitchen finishing its last work and the particular texture of a stone building at night, which was not silence but something denser than silence, the accumulation of all the sounds that had soaked into the walls over generations. After a while, not a timed while, not a planned while, Cypher stood. He took 3 steps toward her. He sat down again, at perhaps 2 feet's distance. He looked at her. She looked at the far wall. Another minute passed, then he walked the remaining 2 feet and placed one large, silver-gray paw on her knee. He applied a deliberate, steady pressure, then sat back again without moving his paw. He looked at the far wall. She breathed. She did not move. She did not speak. She breathed. She wrote in her journal later that night, in letters smaller than she usually wrote, as if the act of recording it too loudly might disturb it. Day 23. Cypher put his paw on my knee. I have been in this palace for 23 days, and this is the first thing that has happened that I feel I can genuinely count. Not because of what I did, because of what he did, on his own terms, in his own time, without any pressure from me. Those are the only kinds of victories that last. She closed the journal. She blew out the lamp. In the corridor, Cypher's footsteps eventually retreated toward the king's quarters. Sarah lay in the dark and thought about what Greta had told her once, about the difference between persuading someone and earning their trust. Persuasion is something you do to people, Greta had said. Trust is something they give you. Your job is to be worth giving it to. She thought she was beginning to understand that more completely than she had when she first heard it. 67 days left. The emergency arrived on the 28th night with no warning, the way true emergencies always did, at the hour when the body was most sure the night had settled and the mind was furthest from readiness. Sarah had been asleep for less than 2 hours. She came fully awake at the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor, not the quiet, familiar movements of the palace at night, but the purposeful, slightly panicked footsteps of someone who needed to cover ground quickly and was not trying to be quiet about it. She was at her door before she had fully processed the sound. Ned was in the corridor outside, pale under his freckles, breathing hard. He had clearly run from some distance. He got the key information out first, which she appreciated. A messenger, arrived from the eastern trade road, had collapsed in the south courtyard. He was down and could not be woken. He had his horse with him, which was standing loose in the courtyard. The gate guards had found him. She was already moving. She pulled her healer's kit from its place on the wardrobe shelf without looking at it. She told Ned to go ahead to the courtyard and make sure no one had moved the man, and she was down the stairs and through the south passage before Ned had finished the sentence. The south courtyard was lit with torches that the guards had brought out, which threw sharp moving shadows across the paving stones and made the scene harder to read than steady light would have. Several people were present, 2 gate guards, a stable hand, and Elda with a lamp, standing at a careful professional distance, as if she understood that getting closer was not her function here, and had already arranged herself accordingly. The horse had been caught, and was being walked quietly by the stable hand along the far wall. The messenger was on his side on the paving stones, and she knelt beside him before she had finished taking in the rest of the scene. She worked fast and thorough, the way Greta had trained her. Check breathing, check pulse, check color, check temperature. Look for what was visible before looking for what wasn't. The man's breathing was shallow and fast, and the quality of it was wrong in a specific way that told her several things at once. His pulse was rapid and irregular. His lips had a blue edge that she had seen before, and that meant the situation was urgent in the particular way that required immediate action, rather than careful planning. She checked his saddlebags, which one of the guards had already removed from the horse and placed nearby. In the inner pocket of the first bag she found a small medicine vial, a standard traveler's pain remedy of the kind sold at road-stop apothecaries all over the kingdom. The wax seal on the cork had been broken recently, not at purchase, at use. The compound in that particular remedy contained an ingredient that a small percentage of people could not tolerate, and the blue edge she had noted on his lips was the specific presentation she associated with that intolerance when the dose had been too much. She stood up and addressed the group efficiently. She needed the medicine cabinet from the kitchen corridor storage, hot water, clean cloths, and the area around the man cleared of everyone, except anyone who could actively help. Elda moved before she finished speaking. For the next 4 hours, Sarah worked. There were 2 points in the night that were harder than the others. The first was around midnight, when the man's breathing changed in a way that required her to make a choice quickly and act on it without the time to verify it, which was not comfortable, but was necessary, and which she handled by setting aside the discomfort and focusing entirely on the work in front of her. The second was near 2 in the morning, when his fever reached a point that made her hands move faster and her mind go very quiet, the specific quiet of concentration that came when there was too much at stake for anything else to exist in the available space. Around 3 in the morning, the fever broke. She felt it happen before she confirmed it with her fingers, a change in the quality of the air around him, the way a person's body registered relief before any visible measurement confirmed it. She checked his pulse. Better. Not right, not recovered, but moving in the right direction for the first time in 4 hours. She sat back on her heels and released a breath that had been, she realized, compressed in her chest for a while. She became aware of the doorway. She looked up. King Aldrich Voss was standing in the doorway of the medical room in full formal dress, suggesting he had come from something official and had not stopped to change. He was standing solidly in the doorway, not at the edge of it, not positioned to leave, the posture of someone who had made a decision to be in this room and had not reconsidered it. His face was its usual composed surface, but he had been there long enough that she understood he had seen most of what had happened in the past hour at least, possibly longer. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at her. He said nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had both been in a difficult room for a long time and did not need to perform anything for each other about it. She turned back to the messenger to make her final checks. She heard footsteps move away from the doorway. She heard them in the corridor, quiet and unhurried. She heard, after a few minutes, a different sound from the kitchen direction, the specific sound of someone who knew where things were and what they needed, moving efficiently through a space they understood. The footsteps returned. She did not look up. Something appeared on the floor beside her right hand. She looked at it. A cup. Dark blue ceramic, warm to the touch. She wrapped her hands around it and found tea. Plain, strong, correct temperature. Not elaborate, not sweetened. The exact tea she would have made for herself if she had a free hand and a moment to do it, which she had not had for 4 hours. She looked at the doorway. Cypher was in it. Not standing. Sitting in the low wooden chair that stood against the wall beside the door. The chair whose position had shifted slightly from where it usually stood, the way a chair's position shifted when it had been sat in. Cypher looked at her from the chair with an expression that was different from his usual watchful assessment. Not warmer, exactly, but less guarded. The specific expression, she would come to understand later, of an animal that has watched someone work very hard for a long time on behalf of someone else and has recalibrated its initial opinion accordingly. She drank the tea. The warmth moved through her hands and then through the rest of her, and she thought that whoever had made it correctly. She thought it was the best tea she had had in 28 days. She stayed with the messenger until near dawn, when she was confident enough in his stability to leave him in the care of the early kitchen staff, who were already up for the breakfast preparation, and who she had already confirmed were reliable. She gave them specific instructions, told them to summon her if anything changed, and went back to the East Wing. She sat at the writing desk. She wrote in her journal, Day 28, emergency. 4 hours. He made me tea. I do not know when he arrived, or how long he sat in the chair before he left, but the chair was warm when Cypher claimed it, which means he had been there for some time. He did not stay. He made tea and left. I have decided that making tea for someone at 3 in the morning silently, without saying anything about it, is possibly the most honest thing I have seen him do. I counted it. She put her head down on her arms on the desk and slept there until the breakfast bell woke her. The argument happened on the 35th day, and it was not, in any traditional sense, planned. She had been crossing the main hall toward the library when the half-open doors of the throne room stopped her feet before her mind had decided to stop them. She heard two voices, Aldrich's and another that she did not recognize, lower and slightly unsteady in the way of a voice trying to hold its composure under strain. She could see through the gap in the doors. A man stood before the throne, perhaps 45, travel-worn, holding a worn leather satchel in both hands. His shoulders had the particular set of someone who had come with an argument prepared and had already been told something that deflated the preparation before it was delivered. Aldrich's voice arrived to her clearly because the throne room was built to carry voices, and his voice was precisely modulated in a way that required no elevation to reach the corners of it. He was explaining that the petition fell outside the grounds of current review, that the land transfer had been processed under the second provision of the Trade Accession Act, that the petitioner's dispute was therefore with the Trade Committee, not with the Crown. The man's response was quiet. She caught only fragments. 40 years, family grant, documentation, procedural refusal, and underneath the words, in the texture of his voice, the specific quality of someone who has exhausted every other avenue and is standing in front of the last one and watching it close. Aldrich told him to appeal the procedural ruling. The man said something else, lower now, nearly inaudible from where she stood, and she could not make out the words, but she could hear the break in his voice, the specific break of someone who has reached the end of what they can carry with composure. She pressed the throne room door open with the flat of her hand and walked in. The effect moved through the room in a wave. The man turned in surprise. The two guards along the wall went perfectly still, the particular stillness of people recalibrating rapidly. One of the advisors sitting at the side table looked as if he might faint, and Aldrich's gaze moved to her immediately, and his expression did not change, but something in it gathered, the way a sky gathers, quietly and completely, before it decides what it is going to do. She walked until she was standing beside the man from the road. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Aldrich. She said, "The second provision of the Trade Accession Act contains an exclusion clause for family-granted lands, when original documentation of grant exists, and when the transfer was not initiated by the landholder." She had read the full administrative law collection in the library on her 19th day, not because she had anticipated needing it, but because reading the frameworks of how a kingdom operated had seemed relevant to understanding the kingdom. If this man has his documentation, the transfer is procedurally void under the exclusion. The Trade Committee cannot close a petition on procedural grounds if those grounds are based on a misapplication of the act. The room was so quiet that she could hear the candles. Aldrich looked at her. His expression was not anger. She had braced for anger, and it was not that. It was something she had not seen on his face before. Not the neutral composure of the everyday, not the very occasional brief loosening of something in his eyes, but something that was genuinely uncertain, the specific expression of someone encountering something they have not encountered before, and are not sure yet what to do with. He said, "You will wait in the corridor." "Of course," she said. She walked out and stood in the corridor, with her hands folded, and her heart rate at a level she considered unreasonable, and she waited. The man came out of the throne room after 8 minutes. She did not need to hear what had happened inside. She could see it in the way he moved, the released tension in his shoulders, the quality of his step, the specific posture of a person who has set down something heavy after a very long time of carrying it. He stopped in front of her in the corridor. He looked at her with the expression of someone who does not know how to say what they want to say, and so says nothing, and lets their face say it instead. Then he turned and walked toward the entrance. She stood in the corridor. Aldrich appeared in the doorway of the throne room and looked at her. She met his gaze and waited. He was quiet for a long moment. The thing his face was doing was the most complicated she had seen it do. Not one thing, but several things at once, layered in a way she could not fully read, and she did not try to, because this was not the moment for analysis. "Come in," he said. The doors closed behind them. She stood in the throne room and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she did not fill the silence. He said, finally, "You have read the entire administrative law collection." "Yes," she said. Why? Because it seemed important to understand how the kingdom worked, she said. And because I read things when I have time, and I have had time. He looked at her with the same uncertain quality she had seen from the corridor, and it was different up close, more present, less contained, the way things always looked different when you were standing in them, rather than watching them from outside. He said, "The farmer's land will be reviewed under the correct provision. The committee will be notified today." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I do not require your thanks." She said, "I know, but I am giving it to you anyway, because it is the right response to the right thing, regardless of whether you require it." Something happened in his face, brief, very small, gone almost before it was there. But she had been watching his face for 35 days, and she had memorized the way its control worked, and she recognized what had happened, not as softness, not as warmth, but as something breaking through the management of it. Something that was real precisely because it had not been approved before it arrived. He said, "You are not what I was told you were." "I know," she said. "What were you told?" "A healer," he said, "a quiet one." She looked at him steadily. "I am a healer," she said, "and I am quiet the majority of the time. But there are things I will not be quiet about. The farmer's situation is one of them. 300 people losing their homes because of an incorrect statutory reading is another." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he nodded. The slow, single nod she had come to understand meant that something had been filed, correctly, in the place where it belonged. She left the throne room. She went to the library, and sat in the chair by the window, and breathed carefully for approximately 6 minutes. Then she opened her journal and wrote, "Today I argued with a king in his throne room. He revised his decision. I do not know what I am doing here anymore, in the sense that what I am doing here has become more complicated than what I was sent here to do, and I am not sure those two things are the same anymore." Below that, she wrote, "The farmer's name is Owen. I learned it from Ned. Owen gets his land back." She closed the journal and went to dinner, and when she sat at the table and Aldrich came in and sat in his chair, he looked at her once across the table, briefly, directly, and the look was not neutral. It was something she did not have a name for, which was new, and which she decided she was not going to try to name yet, because naming things too early had a way of making you stop actually looking at them. The 42nd day came in gray and quiet, and what happened in the library that afternoon was the thing she had not known she was waiting for. She had been working at the long south table for nearly 2 hours on the medicinal plant index for Maris, which had grown into something considerably more comprehensive than she had originally planned, because every reference led to 3 adjacent references, and she had a difficult relationship with leaving things incomplete. The room was cold, in the way stone rooms were always cold in the middle of the day, when the sun had not yet reached the right angle, and the lamp she had lit against the dimness made the table she was working at feel separate from the rest of the room, in a way she found useful for concentration. The library door opened. Aldrich came in. She kept her eyes on her work. He came to the library most mornings, and on certain afternoons, and she had long since learned to exist in it alongside him, without disrupting whatever he came for. The way you occupied a shared room with someone, going about your own business, without making your presence a statement about anything. He did not go to his usual section. He crossed to the long table and sat down at the far end of it, 6 feet from her. He did not have a document. He did not have a book. He sat at the table with his hands flat on its surface, and he looked at the wood grain. She kept working. She turned pages. She made notes. She did not look at him, and she did not alter her pace. After a while, he said, "He used to come in here and read standing up." She set her pen down. Not putting it away, just setting it down. The way you set something down, when you are giving full attention to something else, without making a production of doing so. He could not sit still long enough for proper reading, Aldrich said. He would stand at the shelf and read in place, and I would tell him to sit down, and he would say he would in a minute. He never sat down. She kept her eyes on the table in front of her, aimed at the middle distance, the way she had learned to position herself when she was giving someone all the space of the room. He moved through everything quickly, Aldrich said. He decided how he felt about people in approximately 30 seconds, and he was almost always right. He read people the way some people read weather, by looking, for a moment, at something difficult to quantify, and simply knowing. He paused. I never had that. I have always had to be slower. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the table. He had the expression she had been watching since the second morning. Not closed, not open, but somewhere in the space between them. The expression of someone standing in a doorway looking into a room they had not entered in a long time, and had not decided yet whether to go through. He would have liked you, Aldrich said, with the quiet directness of someone delivering a factual statement. He would have decided that in the first 30 seconds, and he would have told me loudly, and he would have found the whole situation with the council and the charter and the task amusing, in the particular way he found things amusing, that other people treated as serious. Sarah said, he would have been right. Aldrich was quiet. She said, Cypher was his. Cypher belonged to no one, Aldrich said, with the careful precision of someone correcting a thing that mattered to be correct. He stayed near Cale, because Cale gave him what he wanted, company that asked nothing of him. Performance was not something Cale expected from anything. People, animals, furniture. He simply wanted them to be what they were, and found that sufficient. He looked at the table. When Cale died, Cypher came to me. I did not choose it. He simply arrived and stayed. I did not know what to do with him for the first month. She watched the side of his face. Neither do I, most of the time, he said. The corner of Sarah's mouth moved slightly. Neither do I, she said. Something shifted in him. She had been watching him for 42 days, and had learned the precise vocabulary of his face's very small adjustments, and what she saw now was different from any of them. It was not the loosening of the early library moment, or the involuntary reaction to the bread incident, or the almost smile at the garden window. It was something quieter than all of those, something that did not need to be identified to be real. Cypher appeared in the doorway. He crossed the library without hurry, which was entirely characteristic, and he did not go to Aldrich's side of the table or come to hers. He stopped at the midpoint between them, considered the space for a moment with the deliberate attention he brought to everything, and then sat down in the exact center of the gap between them. He folded his legs beneath him with the settled satisfaction of something that has arrived at the correct solution to a problem it has been considering. Aldrich looked at the cat. He said, very quietly, as if saying it more for himself than for any listener. He does that when he has decided something. Sarah looked at Cypher. Cypher looked at the far bookshelf with the untroubled composure of a creature whose internal accounting was entirely in order. She realized, sitting in the library on the 42nd day, that somewhere over the past weeks something had shifted in her, without her noticing the moment it happened. She was no longer thinking about the charter when she sat at breakfast. She was no longer measuring her choices by whether they were moving the task forward. She was no longer in this palace doing a job. She was here. She was in this room. She was learning a person the way she had always learned people when she did it correctly. By being present and genuinely interested. By staying without demanding anything. By offering what she actually had, rather than what she thought was required. And she had started to care about the outcome, not because of Hollow Creek, and not because of the 90 days, but because she was sitting across a table from someone who was trying, in the smallest and most careful possible ways, to reach past something enormous, and she wanted that to work. That realization frightened her more than the thought of failing had ever done. She picked up her pen and returned to her index. Aldrich stayed at the far end of the table for another half hour. He did not have a document or a book, and he did not look at anything in particular, and when he left he did not say goodbye, which was his way, and she did not look up. Cypher stayed until he heard Aldrich's footsteps in the corridor, then followed, and the library was quiet again. She looked at the empty floor where the cat had been sitting. She read the margin note she had made without thinking. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned the page and kept working. The 69th morning began as ordinarily as mornings came, which Sarah had learned did not mean much about what the morning would eventually contain. She had been in the herb garden since first light. The south wall thyme had needed attention for a week, and she had been putting it off in favor of the seedling beds, but this morning she had come down early specifically to deal with it, pulling the growth that had overtaken the pathstones and cutting back what had gotten unruly, and the work was satisfying in the uncomplicated way of physical work done in cold, clean air. She was finishing the last section of the south border when Ned appeared at the east wing door, and she knew from the quality of his approach, unhurried but with a particular quality of intention, that he had come specifically to find her, which meant something had happened. She stood up and looked at him. He said, "Cypher is in the courtyard." She waited. "He's at the bottom of the east wing steps," Ned said. "He's been there since before I came down to start the morning fire. He has something, he brought something, and he left it there, and he's been sitting next to it." "What did he bring?" she said. Ned told her. She set down her garden shears, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to the east wing steps. Cypher was there exactly as described, sitting upright beside a small sparrow he had placed on the stone step with a care that was visible in the placement. Not dropped, not left carelessly, but set, precisely, with the deliberate attention of an animal that understands the significance of what it is doing. She crouched on the step and looked at the sparrow and then at Cypher. He met her gaze with his usual steadiness, but without the watchfulness she had grown accustomed to in the early weeks. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past few weeks, without the assessment overlay, without the calibrating quality, simply looking, the way something looks when it has already finished deciding and is now past the deciding. She had enough knowledge of cats, from years of patients who kept them, from reading, from observation, to understand completely what was in front of her. This was not a random behavior. This was the specific offering that cats made to those they had chosen to regard as worth the highest gift available to them. It was not casual. It was the most direct language Cypher had. She did not reach for him. She stayed in her crouch on the step and she was quiet, and she looked at him for a long moment. She said, very softly, "All right." She said it the way you said it, when something had finally arrived, after a very long wait, and you were not going to make too much of it, because making too much of it was the wrong response to something that had happened on its own terms. Cypher blinked once, slowly, and looked at the courtyard. Behind her, she heard sounds from the palace windows, quiet movements, the sound of someone pulling a shutter, the particular stillness of people who had caught something happening and had gone still themselves. She became aware of Maris in the kitchen doorway, and Ned on the second floor landing above, and Elda at the far end of the corridor with her back appropriately straight and an expression that was professionally contained but had something working underneath it. She stood up. The corridor to her left changed in the way it always changed when Aldrich was present. The particular quality of the air, the 2-second shift in everything, the way a room registered the entrance of someone who occupied it fully even in their stillness. He came to the doorway of the east wing. He took in the scene. Cypher, the step, her. He went very still. The palace around them went very still. She looked at him directly, because she had learned that looking away from him at moments that mattered was not useful, and was in fact a form of avoidance she could not afford. He looked at the sparrow on the step for a long, quiet moment. Then he looked at her, and his face did not do the single, identifiable thing she could name. It did several things at once, in the layered, simultaneous way she had come to associate with the moments when the management of his expression was operating at a slight delay behind what was actually happening. He said, quietly, "In 3 years, he has not done that for anyone." "I know," she said. "Ned told me." "Did you understand what it means?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet. She said, "He doesn't give things he doesn't mean." "No," Aldrich said, "he does not." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the courtyard was quiet around them, and Cypher sat beside the step, with the composed certainty of a creature that has placed a bet it has no doubt about. She said, "Neither do I." She set the pen down. She looked at the blank page. Some things did not want to be reduced to sentences. Some things needed to exist in their full form, unedited, before the words were available for them. She had learned, in 4 years of training, that the attempt to record something too quickly often produced a record of the attempt, rather than a record of the thing itself. She closed the journal without writing. She went downstairs and ate dinner at the same table she ate at every evening, and Aldrich sat in his chair at the head of it, and the silence between them had a quality that it had not had before dinner on the 69th day, and the quality was different in a way that she could feel, but did not try to catalogue, because some things needed to remain in their full form for a while before they were ready to be categorized. Cypher sat in the doorway through the entire meal. He was still. He did not patrol or pace or conduct his usual private assessments of the room's condition. He simply sat, settled, with the composed confidence of a creature whose work was complete. The elder council arrived on the 84th day, 6 days earlier than agreed, in 3 black carriages that came through the outer gate in the early afternoon, without sending word ahead. Sarah saw them from the herb garden. She stood among the winter time, and watched the carriages move through the gate, with the particular efficient purpose of people who had somewhere specific to be, and considered advance notification a courtesy that served other people more than it served them. She stood there for a moment after they passed from her sight line, then she set down her garden shears, took off her work gloves, and walked inside. 6 days early was not nothing. 6 days early meant the council had decided on their own terms, at a time they chose, which meant either the situation had resolved itself more clearly than they expected, or something else was happening that she had not been told. Elda found her in the East Wing corridor before she reached her room, which meant Elda had been coming to find her specifically. The head steward's expression was the most precisely managed Sarah had seen it in 84 days. The expression of a woman who was holding a very specific line because she had identified that the line needed holding. She told Sarah the council had arrived. She told her a formal dinner had been arranged for that evening. She told her the king was aware. Then she paused in the particular way she paused when she had something additional to say that she was calibrating carefully. She told Sarah that the council had been receiving correspondence about the situation from multiple sources within the palace over the period of the assignment. She told her that Councillor Fenn, specifically, had revised his understanding of the nature of the task over recent weeks. Sarah said, "What did he think the task was, originally?" Elda looked at her with the direct, unhedged look of someone delivering something that was important to be delivered clearly. He thought he was sending someone to demonstrate that the king was capable of being influenced, to show the kingdom's allies and the border lords that Aldrich Voss was not entirely unreachable, that he could be reached from outside himself, which would make him more legible as a political figure, and therefore more trusted as a king. She paused. A demonstration, even a sincere one, but a demonstration. Sarah said nothing. "I believe," Elda said, "that Fenn now understands that what has actually been happening is rather more complicated and considerably less demonstrable than that." She walked away with the efficiency of a woman who had said exactly what she needed to say and had other things to attend to. Sarah stood in the corridor. She thought about Councillor Fenn's original intention, the demonstration theory, the idea that what the king needed was to be shown to be reachable, that what the kingdom needed was a visible sign of change, rather than the change itself. She thought about how that had differed from what she had actually done, which was not to demonstrate anything to anyone, but to simply be present, day after day, in a way that was honest and patient, and asked nothing in return. She thought about the charter. She thought about Hollow Creek. She had not thought about them daily, in the way she had in the first weeks. They had not left her. They were not absent from her understanding of why she was here, but they had stopped being the thing she moved through each day toward. Somewhere in the middle weeks, the direction had shifted. She had stopped moving toward a goal and simply started living in the space. She did not know whether that was success or whether it was something more complicated than success, and she suspected the distinction was going to matter. She dressed for dinner in her best clothes, which were sufficient without being impressive, and she arranged her hair, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the writing desk. She looked like herself. Tired in the particular way of someone who had been doing something genuinely demanding for a long time, but clear-eyed, more settled than she had been when she arrived, less certain about various things she had been certain about before she came, and more certain about various things she had not known to think about at all. She went downstairs. The dining hall had been arranged for the occasion, additional candles along the walls, a full table service, the kind of correctness that the palace produced without difficulty when something required it. The council members were already seated when she arrived, arranged along the left side of the long table, and they looked at her with the carefully calibrated attention of people who had come here specifically to look at a situation, and had arrived with questions they intended to have answered by what they observed. Aldrich came in last, as he came in every evening, without hurry, and sat in his chair at the head of the table. He looked at the council members with the composed equanimity he brought to everything. He looked at Sarah with the same. The dinner moved through its required progression. The council made conversation that was correct and political without being heavy, and Aldrich participated in it with the competent, measured attention he brought to every official function. Sarah was asked 2 questions directly, one by Councillor Fenn about her work in the palace, one by a younger council member about the herb garden improvements she had implemented, and she answered both honestly and without elaboration. Councillor Brennan was the one who shifted the register. He had a narrow face, and the manner of someone who had specific political concerns that he had been patient about raising, and had run out of patience for. He addressed Sarah directly, and said that he understood she had intervened in a petitioner session in the throne room. Yes, she said. He noted that this was unusual for a health consultant. The circumstances were unusual, she said. He started to say something else, and Aldrich said, without changing his tone or pace, without raising his volume at all, and without looking at Brennan, the lady's intervention was appropriate. The petition had been mishandled due to an incorrect statutory application. The error was mine. It has been corrected. The phrasing fell into the dinner with the quiet, complete weight of something said by a person who did not say things they did not mean. The word he used, the lady, placed her, in the language of the court, in a specific position relative to the table. It was formal and clear, and it was a statement about how she stood in this palace, offered in the manner of a fact rather than an argument, without explanation and without elaborating. Brennan said nothing further on the subject. Sarah did not look at Aldrich. She kept her eyes on her plate. But she was aware of every council member registering what had just happened, and she was aware that they were drawing conclusions, and she thought that the conclusions were not entirely wrong. Near the end of dinner, when the plates were being removed and the conversation had moved to the spring planting outlook, she felt the surface of Aldrich's hand come to rest briefly on hers, under the edge of the table. Firm, deliberate, exactly 2 seconds. Then it was gone, and his hand was back in its usual position, and he was responding to something Fenn had said about grain supply in the northern district with his full, measured attention. She looked at her own hand on the table. She breathed carefully. Under Aldrich's chair, Cypher was lying down, not conducting assessments, not monitoring the room's conditions, simply lying down, with the settled composure of a creature for whom the evening had gone exactly as it should. After dinner, when the council had retired and Elda had gone to see to their arrangements, Sarah walked back to her room through the quiet evening corridors. She was aware, without looking, of Aldrich's footsteps somewhere behind her, not following, simply moving through the same corridors in the direction of his own wing. She heard them turn off into the west passage, and then she was in the east wing, and the palace was quiet. She sat at the desk and looked at the window for a long time. She wrote in her journal. Eventually, day 84. The council came early. Brennan pushed. Aldrich answered. Under the table, 2 seconds. Exactly. Cypher lay down through the entire dinner, and did not move once. These are the facts. I am not sure what comes next. She was quiet for a moment. She wrote, 6 days left. I am not sure I know, anymore, what the end of 6 days means. The 90th day arrived, as endings did, when they were also beginnings. Quietly, without announcement, the ordinary light of morning, coming through the east window, exactly as it had for 89 mornings before it. Sarah was awake before the light changed. She had not slept badly. She had simply been awake, which was different, and she had lain in the dark for a while thinking about the letter that had arrived at her kitchen table 90 days ago, and the bag she had packed in the pre-dawn quiet, and the road east she had walked before the village was up. She thought about what she had known when she set out, and what she knew now, and the distance between those two things was very large. She got up. She dressed carefully. She packed her bag. She did it with the same deliberate attention she had brought to packing 90 days ago. Her journal first, then her reference books, then her healer's kit, then the rest. Methodical. She had never been a person who left things in disarray when she left a place, and she was not going to be one now. When the bag was packed, she looked at the room. The oil lamp wick was low. The mirror had the spot in its lower corner that she had noticed on the 41st day. The writing desk had the faint water ring from 90 mornings of cups. The window looked out over the herb garden, where she could see, from this angle, the south wall thyme she had trimmed, and the new seedling beds she had put in along the east border, and the stone bench near the fence where she had sat on cold mornings thinking about Greta, and about patience, and about what it meant to do something honestly, rather than strategically. She had left the garden better than she found it. She thought that counted for something. She picked up her bag and went downstairs and through the east wing door to the morning courtyard. The air was cold. Autumn had settled into the palace grounds over the past several weeks, and the courtyard stones were cold even through her boots. The sky above the walls was pale and clear in the way of mornings that were fully committed to themselves. She set her bag on the bottom step. She stood in the pale morning light and looked at the courtyard. The east wall, the gate arch, the towers above the main entrance that she had looked up at on arrival, from outside, and that looked different from inside, not smaller, but more familiar. The shape of a place you had lived in for 3 months, rather than a place that was trying to establish its authority over you. She had been standing there for perhaps 4 minutes when a sound came from the east wing doorway behind her. She turned. Cypher came down the 2 stone steps with the composed authority that was entirely his, and that she recognized now, as well as she recognized her own gait. He came across the courtyard to where she was standing, and he stopped. He looked at her. Then he walked, not toward her, and not away from her, around her, left side, across in front, right side and back. A complete figure 8, slow and deliberate. Then again, and again. The precise gesture that she had read about and observed in other cats over the years, and that meant, in the language cats used for the things they found important, something between, "You belong here," and "I have decided this, and this is decided." She watched him. Her throat tightened in a way she had not entirely expected. She heard the door. She waited until the footsteps had descended the 2 steps and crossed to the courtyard stone and stopped. Then she turned. Aldrich stood in the courtyard. He was wearing plain dark clothes, not the formal dress of official function, not the composed arrangement of the public-facing king. Just clothes. The clothes of someone who had gotten up because there was somewhere they needed to be, and the being there had been more urgent than the preparation for it. He looked at her bag on the step. He looked at Cypher, still moving through his figure 8 with the absolute, unhurried confidence of a creature that was going to continue until the situation was correctly resolved. He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the direct, unhurried way he said everything. "The cat will stop eating if you go." He has communicated this to me through a sequence of deliberate and well-organized actions over the past several days that I will not detail, but that have been thoroughly convincing. She looked at Cypher. Cypher paused in the figure 8 and sat down exactly in the center of the gap between them, and he looked at each of them in turn with the golden eyes that had been watching her since the first corridor on the first evening of the first day. She looked at Aldrich. His eyes were amber in the morning light, and they were doing the thing they had started doing in the later weeks. Not the single, identifiable shift she had learned to read, but the full, simultaneous complexity of several things at once. Several doors opened to varying degrees, the face of someone who was present in a way that required no management because the management had stopped. She said, "You could have asked me directly." "I am aware," he said. "But you used the cat." "He volunteered," he said. She looked at Cypher, who sat between them in the courtyard with the absolute, settled certainty of a creature that had placed a bet precisely because it had already calculated the outcome and wanted the record to show it knew. She said, "The council delivered their judgment this morning before I came down. Hollow Creek keeps its charter." "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You knew before I did." "Yes." She thought about what it meant that he had come to the courtyard in plain clothes at this hour, knowing the council's outcome, knowing she knew it too, and had let the cat go first. She thought about a man who had organized every day of his life into function and schedule and productive occupation, who had stood in a garden in the early morning not knowing he was being watched and allowed his shoulders to say something his words never did. She thought about tea at 3 a.m, left without a word. She thought about 2 seconds under a formal dinner table. She thought about the painting in the north hallway, 2 boys in a sunlit garden, one of them laughing. She said, "Was there a particular reason you did not simply tell me the outcome yourself?" He looked at her. His face was doing the most complicated thing it had ever done, and she did not try to catalog it, because she did not want to be cataloging when she should be simply looking. He said, "You had already decided to leave. If I had led with the charter outcome, you would have thanked me properly and gone. The cat would have escalated beyond what was reasonable." He paused, "And this way is less certain." She looked at him. He looked at her. Cypher did not move from the center of the courtyard. He looked at each of them, with the unhurried confidence of a creature that has done its work and knows it. She thought about Greta. She thought about the specific thing Greta had said on the last morning of her formal training, when Sarah had asked how you knew when you were done with a patient, when you had done what you could, when staying longer crossed from care into something else. Greta had said, "You are done when they can continue without you, and not before. Staying past that is for you, not for them. But leaving before that is also for you, and the trick is knowing which one you are doing, and being honest about it." She thought about what she was doing. She thought about whether leaving this morning was for her, or for the person in front of her. She thought about the herb garden and the library, and the palace's evening quiet, and the writing desk, with its water ring, and Ned's morning appearances in doorways, with pieces of useful small information, and Maris's laugh in the kitchen, and Elda's perfectly controlled expression at moments that required control. She thought about all the small things she had come to know about a place by living in it for 3 months. She thought about amber eyes in morning light, doing the most complicated and present thing they had ever done. She picked up her bag from the step. She turned and walked back up the 2 steps to the east wing door. She held the door open. After a moment, Cypher rose from the center of the courtyard and walked through it without a backward glance, with the composure of a creature that had correctly anticipated every element of the resolution and found the reality matching his projection in all important respects. She looked back at Aldrich. He was still in the courtyard, still watching her. The corner of his mouth had moved. She had been looking for that movement for 90 days. She had first seen it at the garden window on the 23rd evening, from a distance of 2 floors in failing light. She had seen it again in the library on the 42nd afternoon. She knew it with certainty now, standing 3 feet from it in the cold morning light of the 90th day. What it was, what it meant, and what it had cost him to let it happen in front of someone. It was a smile. It was small and controlled, and entirely characteristic of the man it belonged to, which was to say it was not the smile of someone who had been made comfortable, or made safe, or made easy. It was the smile of someone who had decided, carefully and on their own terms, to let something be true, which was the only kind of smile that had ever meant anything. She set her bag down inside the east wing door. She said, "Breakfast is in 30 minutes. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he walked to the door and came through it, and she let it close behind them. The east corridor was quiet in the morning way, the palace's earliest sounds still finding their shape. Cypher walked ahead of them both, tail raised at a particular angle, at a pace that suggested he was neither in a hurry, nor indifferent to the direction of things. Sarah walked beside Aldrich toward the east wing stairs. She was aware of the space between them, the particular quality of it, the way it had changed from the first evening of the first day. Then it had been the space of a room that told her to leave. Now it was the space of something that was deciding, quietly and on its own terms, what it wanted to be next. She had come to this palace to make a king gentle. She had come with a task and a deadline and 300 families at stake. She had come with her healer's training and her stubbornness and a full understanding that she would be working against the grain of everything this man had built to protect himself from the particular risk of being reached. She had not made him gentle. She could see that clearly now, in the same way she could see the herb garden from her room's east window, with the specific clarity of having looked at something from a correct distance for a long time. You did not make a person anything. The most you could do was be present in a way that was honest and patient and genuinely interested, and trust that if something was actually there to be uncovered, the conditions you created would give it room to surface on its own. Gentleness was not installed. It was excavated, carefully, by the right combination of time and honesty, and the particular courage of staying in a room that told you to leave until the room got used to the fact that you were not going anywhere. She had stayed. That was all. She had stayed 90 days, and she had been herself for all of them, and she had trusted that to be enough, and it had been. Cypher paused at the top of the east staircase, and turned to look at both of them with his gold eyes. He held the look for exactly the amount of time he deemed sufficient, which was not long, and then he turned and continued down the corridor toward the dining hall. The morning light was coming through the upper windows now, the proper morning light, the light that belonged to a day that had committed to itself. It fell on the stone floors in the particular way it had fallen every morning for 90 days, familiar in the way of things that had been there when you arrived, and would be there after you. She walked toward the dining hall. Aldrich walked beside her. At the corner of the east corridor, where the narrow north hallway branched off toward the portrait of two boys in a sunlit garden, she glanced down it, as she always did when she passed. She could not see the portrait from the corner. She did not need to. She turned toward the dining hall, and the morning, and whatever came next. Behind them, the palace held its quiet, the way it had always held it, not the brittle quiet of a house where no one spoke for fear of the consequences, but the settled quiet of a place that had, slowly, and without quite knowing when it happened, started to hold something other than distance in its walls. Something that was harder to name than governance, or function, or political stability. Something that had needed 3 months, and 1 silver cat, and 90 days of someone who refused to leave to arrive at. Cypher sat at the dining hall entrance and waited for them both. He had known, she thought, from the first corridor of the first evening, from the moment those gold eyes had tracked her as she walked past him without going around. He had known how it ended, and he had placed his bet, and he had watched it unfold with the absolute confidence of a creature that had calculated correctly and was entirely at peace with his own methods. She sat at her usual place. Aldrich sat at the head of the table. Maris appeared in the kitchen doorway with the breakfast service, and Ned came in from the corridor with the morning documents, and Elda stood at her regular position near the door, with her silver hair pinned precisely back, and an expression that was professionally composed, and that had something underneath it, that had always been there, but that she had, for 89 days, been too correct to let show. Today she let it show, just slightly, in the particular way that people let things show when something they have waited for a long time has finally arrived. The morning light came through the high windows. Cypher walked to his position beneath Aldrich's chair and lay down. The 90th day had begun the way the 91st would begin, and the 92nd after that, and all the days that followed those, in this palace where the stone held the memory of everything that had happened in it, and where the herb garden was a little better than it had been 3 months ago, and where a silver cat had placed a bet, at the very beginning, on the very first evening, in the very first corridor, and had never once doubted it. The bell on the north tower rang the morning hour. She picked up her cup. She stayed.